Hello viewers, welcome to MOOC's online course on Visual Perception and Art, a survey across the cultures. This is lecture number 50 in this course, and we will be discussing the realistic art of the West. Realistic art is something that we have already referred to when we were talking about the mimetic art. Now, mimetic art is a philosophical and a conceptual, a psychological, and of course a technical process. And there is also a whole range of variations within this category of mimetic art. In that sense, mimetic art and realistic art is pretty close to each other. But when you look at the whole tradition of realistic art separately, of course mimesis is there, but more than mimesis, certain very special kind of visual perception is operational here, and also we can see how not just the artists or the art language, but the entire culture was obsessed with realistic art to the extent that anything and everything that was beyond the orbit of realistic art was considered to be not art at all or inferior art. Realistic art can also be replaced with the term naturalistic art, because by and large realistic art tries to not only imitate nature or follow nature faithfully, but tries to visually record nature, visually recapture nature in a way that evokes a feeling as if you are looking back at the real nature again. Secondly, naturalism also implies that everything that you do in the work of art, technically speaking as well as formally speaking, in terms of representation speaking, everything that you do in your work of art should derive primarily from nature. Even if you are drawing or painting a character or a figure which is completely imaginative, maybe from mythology or from some story which never happened in real life, even if the character is something that is absolutely a figure of imagination, still the way you are supposed to reconstruct visually that character on your canvas or paper should follow a naturalistic model of rendering and representation. So this is where realistic art also gets very problematic. On the one hand, we are trying to say that realistic art is a very strong demonstration of mimetic art, and on the other hand, we are actually talking about a certain kind of visual perception which encourages the artist to mimic reality, not really to imitate reality, and mimic through a certain kind of technique, a technique that was developed over the years, a technique of painting which is supposed to make the surface of the represented object very tangible, which is supposed to follow the exact anatomical distribution or structure of a body, which is supposed to follow the exact proportion of the body or the figure you are trying to represent, which is also supposed to follow a sense of spatial depth that we encounter in our real life. So in a sense, we encounter not exactly a reality, but a virtual reality. Virtual reality, which is technically called illusion, and the whole process is called illusionism. We have mentioned this concept of illusionism in one of our previous lectures, and now we shall see some variants of it. Since realistic term can also be replaced with the term naturalistic art, then let us see some of the main categories of realistic art that dominated the history of Western art for a long time. In realistic art, you of course have this huge number of paintings coming under the category of scenic beauty of nature, which in other words we call landscape or natural scenes. But the point here is that as a painter belonging to this category, you are supposed to represent nature in a picturesque mood. You are supposed to represent nature in a particular technique that is supposed to give the viewer an illusion of looking at the real nature. Thirdly, it is supposed to be painted in a light situation, in a kind of illumination, which will always give you a sense of also possession, that is a tangibility, a surface quality. So, in realistic art, whether it is a scenic beauty of nature or an interior or domestic scene, there is always this tactile quality, this touch quality, this touch sensation, which has been considered as imperative, as something that has to be there in any realistic painting. Then thirdly, along with this quality of touch, along with this sensation of tactile quality, realistic painting is supposed to evoke a sense of possession, a materialistic feeling. So, the visual perception, which is part and parcel of realistic art, involves this materiality, a material possession, a great impact of the material culture on a society. So, it appears that the visual perception regarding realistic art is integral to a certain kind of material culture of the West. Even when you are looking at a historical painting like this, when the incident depicted is not a contemporary incident, the incident took place hundreds or thousands of years back before this painting was painted, yet the way the depiction has been done, look at the representational details, the representational character, the entire approach to represent and to depict that historical event is tied up with this materiality I was talking about. In fact, if you are not told, it's difficult to believe that the incident took place 2000 years before the painting was painted. So, the whole idea is to create a representation as a make-believe visual experience. The whole idea is to make the painting, not only the painting, even history, the past, an incident that you have never seen, an event that even the painter have never seen, but he is trying to make it tangible, he is trying to make it real. So, realistic art in the West or realism in the West is on the one hand tied up with this materiality or this overwhelming presence of a material culture, and on the other hand this realistic art or realism is also tied up with this idea that an incident, an object, an event, no matter whenever it might have happened, can be made very tangible, very close, very palpable to the viewers who are looking at it. Religious subject matters, Christian themes for that matter in the West, from Renaissance period onwards, have always been shown rather realistically, to the extent that one is almost made to believe that these religious figures like Jesus Christ, Virgin Mary, lived in the time when these particular paintings were painted. The realistic art and realistic painting, more specifically, always try to employ the idea of perspective, not only to create spatial depth, but also to give you a feeling of the ability or the entitlement to capture that space. By the same token, when a realistic painter paints a painting based on either a religious theme or a historical theme, none of which he had ever seen or observed, but by virtue of this realism, by virtue of this tactile quality, by virtue of this very convincing spatial construction, the distance between when that particular painting is painted and when that particular religious or mythological or historical theme ever happened is reduced to an illusion of experience. So, realistic painting, since it ultimately gives birth to illusionism and also makes even a non-existing theme a tangible existence, for the viewers, as far as the visual perception is concerned, nothing is left to imagination. Everything is visible, everything is physical, everything is tangible right in front of their eyes on the canvas or in a stone sculpture like this. Even in sculpture, the great sculptors like Michelangelo was able to bring that sense of illusion to the extent that it's almost hard to believe when you have a look at these sculptures for the first time that they are made in stone. Marble stone has been transformed into a material character that leaves behind its stone character and imitates the feel of the drapery, the feel of the skin, the feel of the flesh depicted. It is this transformation that realistic painting is all about. Whether you are doing it in oil paint or you are carving out a sculpture in stone, you need to transform the materiality of the medium into an illusion of the materiality of the things depicted. And as a result, our visual perception also, when we are looking at realistic art, begins to adjust with this transformation. In an Indian sculpture like that of a Kushana sculpture made in red sandstone, an example of that we have already seen in one of our previous lectures, if you remember. We have seen that the whole strength, character, the pride, glory, and the power and a sense of authority of that character, of that king, Kushana king precisely, has been partly expressed through the form, that is the body, gesture, posture, and to a great extent through the material character of the stone. In order to do that, the Indian sculptor never got rid of the original material character of the stone. Rather, he always tried to retain that character, because he noticed that within the material character of a stone lies the message that he wants to convey through the figure of the Kushana king. But in case of Western realistic art, it is just the opposite. The whole idea, the whole approach is to get the marble stone rid of its own characteristic features and make it look like whatever you are trying to depict. If it is a cloth, though it is made in marble, it should give you a feeling that you are looking at real cloth, to the extent you almost feel like touching it. But the moment you touch, you know you are touching a stone, not a cloth. When it is a human body, the carving is done in such a way that it replaces the character of the stone in stone with the character of and the palpability of human flesh, human body, human warmth, so on and so forth. To the extent that you almost tend to forget that it is made in stone and you are about to touch that body, and then you realize that it is not real human body, it is stone. In Indian art, because it is not basically a realistic art, they have always maintained a balance between the material quality of the medium and the message that it wants to convey through their art. But then, in many of these realistic art examples like this one and this one, within a span of a couple of 100 years, the Western artists picked up the trick of making realistic art really very well. And that includes not just perspective and proportion, it also includes the technique of oil painting, the technique of pencil drawing, the technique of pen and ink drawing. So it's a medium that is very important for them as well. Of course, they never wanted to retain the original quality of medium always, but there was a transformation, a process of transformation that has always been the prime concern for many of these realistic artists. Another aspect of realism or realistic art in the West was directly addressing the contemporary reality, like this painting, painted by Delacroix, a French painter. In 1830, he creates this painting titled Liberty Leading the People. Liberty Leading the People was made in response to the political upheaval that would have resulted in the overthrow of the reigning monarch Charles X. Clearly, this is a work that is based on contemporary reality with direct reference to an event. So, the realistic perception, the visual perception with regard to the realistic art in the West is, on the one hand, about making a tangible representational language or a statement, and on the other hand, like this example, it's about directly addressing the contemporary reality, like this painting by Delacroix, which is about the French Revolution, and also this painting by Francisco Goya, which he painted in 1814, and it's called the 3rd of May. This painting is painted as an immediate reaction to the horrific incident that took place in Madrid on 2nd and 3rd of May 1808. Hundreds of Spanish freedom fighters were massacred by the French army, Goya in this painting not only depicted the incident but expressed the brutality. This painting is considered by many as the first modern painting in the world history. Whether in this painting by Goya or the earlier painting by Delacroix, in both these paintings, of course, certain principles of realistic art are there, but more than that, it is about the expression of or a direct expression of an immediate realistic situation, political and social. That provides a new definition, a new dimension to the whole notion of realistic art in the West. So, in the hands of Delacroix and Francisco Goya, realistic art are kind of graduated from merely a project of tangible representation to a project of social and political commitment. So, whether it is a new classical painting where accurate principles of realistic art have been applied on the painting, or a romantic painting by Turner where you see the realism transgresses the border of optical accuracy and moves on to the realm of pictorial turmoil and pictorial expression, they all become a part of the larger notion of realistic art in the West. But during the same time of Romanticism, in early and mid 19th century, we have somebody like Caspar David Friedrich from North Europe in Germany, who was doing highly romantic, unusual, very discomforting paintings, but with accurate realistic details like this one or this one. Meanwhile, we must remember that photography came into being around 1840, and photography, as we have already seen, was not just a new way of making images, but it proposed a new way of looking or seeing the visual world. And with the advent of photography and with the emergence of these kind of photographs, the painters soon realized that they would be very soon surpassed by this new art of photography in terms of capturing the real life details and also the real life movements within one single frame. So, there was a crisis in the realistic art, a crisis in the mimetic philosophy at this point during the mid 19th century. Yet, before that, sometimes around 1820, that is early 19th century, there was this British painter called Constable, who was continuing with a certain kind of realistic painting of nature with accurate details and light and shade. And we also have somebody like Turner, who upsets the notion of realistic art with his most unusual and extraordinary paintings like this. So, with the invention of camera and emergence of photography as a major mode of visual reconstruction, the accurate realistic art took a backseat and a new variant of realistic art came into being. This new version of realistic art never snapped the ties with the real visual stimuli, but altered the visual perception in a way that certain techniques and methods of painting became more pronounced than the optical recognition of the depicted visual reality assumed a new challenge. So, Turner upsets the hitherto realistic notion of realistic art, though he is still realistic, he is still trying to depict the reality that he was not imagining, but he was seeing, he was observing, but he was using a different technique of representation, which was a radical kind of, which made a radical shift from the academic realistic art which was prevalent before. And around the same time, a little later, around 1872. We also have somebody like Claude Monet coming up with his most unusual kind of painting called Impression Sunrise, and again it relied highly on a real life observation of a sunrise, but the method of depiction did not follow the usual technique and method of realistic art. So, where do you place the paintings of the likes of Turner and Monet, like this one as well? Meanwhile, as a continuation of that social realism, we have seen that how figuration itself have changed from a proper anatomical kind of construction to a more free rendering of drawing of figures depending upon their social plight. So, even figuration changed a great deal under the impact of this new variant of realism, and social realism and social concern was one of the major factors. And then you have different kind of figurations when pictorial realism and a different kind of pictorial framing became the new concern for many painters, for example, Degas. Even Gustave Courbet, who was known as a foremost painter of the realism movement, was more or less conforming to the realistic principles, but yet he had already started playing with the notion of realism by leaving out certain details, by focusing on certain details at the cost of the others, and this is all happening because of their social engagement with the real life observation. Then we have this post-impressionist painter in Paris called Toulouse-Lautrec. So Toulouse-Lautrec was exercising whole lot of freedom in the figuration. Renoir was not only dealing with this new figuration, but also he was dealing with the light and shadow in a completely new way. Now, all these things in a way are part of this larger tradition of realistic art, but at the same time creating new avenues for our visual perception vis-a-vis realism in Western art. So these paintings, like, you cannot call this painting a non-realistic painting. There is no way that you can categorize this painting as an example of non-mimetic painting. Yet it is not realistic in the sense Leonardo's painting is realistic. It is not realistic in the sense Vermeer's painting is realistic, or any Renaissance or Baroque painter's painting is realistic. It is the technique that makes it very non-realistic, very technical, but again the impression of the painting when you look at it from a distance is highly convincing. Another painting by Lautrec. Then Van Gogh. You can look at these innumerable beautiful paintings by Van Gogh, whether it is a landscape or still life or anything else, and then you will see, or for that matter look at this painting by César. You will see that they have all retained a certain kind of allegiance to the observed reality, that is the landscape, nature, people. Yet they were all trying out, working out their own methods and languages of communication. Now all these things together give us an idea, including this still life by César, that realism, despite the dominant notion that realism is only connected to realistic art, and realistic art is only about the application of these few principles like the laws of perspective, chiaroscuro, and spatial depth, receding figures, etc., etc. We have something else happening in the history of Western art from mid-19th century onwards. You cannot say these artists are non-realistic artists. They are all working within the ambit of realism, yet they are all trying out different modes of realism, which in turn is compelling us, the viewers and the students of art, to understand the visual perception vis-a-vis realism from different angles. It's not about a direct correspondence. There are many layers of realism as much as there are many layers in visual perception as well. So realistic art around very early 20th century received a major jolt when artists like Picasso and Braque altered the entire visual perception regarding realism in art. No, they did not go for abstraction straight away. They simply questioned and challenged what we perceived in realism in art so far. So Picasso paints something like this, which cannot be called a realistic art, or something like this, which also cannot be called realistic art, but there is an element of representation with reference to reality. But more than that, what they are doing is they are focusing on the technical aspects of visual communication, that is the language, the grammar, the syntax of visual communication, and that in turn, particularly the students of modern Western art, that in turn for these people, the students of modern Western art, it becomes mandatory that you also keep expanding the possibilities of visual perception. Otherwise, you won't be able to have any clue whatsoever what Picasso is exactly doing in this painting, or what Braque was doing in his painting, or even what exactly the later, more complex kind of artists and sculptors in modern art were all talking about. Thank you.